Hi everyone, welcome to the third lecture. If you haven't viewed 1 and 2 already, please go back and do that. I'm going to try to jump back to lecture 2 because I know I had to wrap it up pretty quickly. Try to keep these to 15 minutes so I don't kind of lose anyone's attention, which means I sometimes move too quickly. So I apologize for that. I'm going to jump back because it ties in nicely. These last 2 lectures are interconnected intimately, so we'll be able to jump back a little bit. But this third lecture is going to look a little bit about what are these long-term ramifications of transatlantic slavery, and what does it mean to say that race is socially constructed. And when we're talking about our map here, we're really thinking broadly. I mean, actually our circle should really encompass the whole world because really since 1492, since 1500, when this class kind of begins, race has grown. The idea of race has grown to be something that was kind of marginal to something that's kind of believed to be inherently true. And one thing I want to try to use this lecture for is to dispel that idea. That race is entirely constructed by social conditions, and that it doesn't actually exist in anything other than our minds. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And another thing that's really important to bring up is this map again, to talk about the distribution, what's called a diaspora, right? A movement of people from one region to another away from their homeland. The African diaspora, these 12.5 million people at least, if not more, moved from the West Coast and even interior Africa and the East Coast in some instances to other regions of the world, most notably the Americas, but also up into Europe, also into the northern African region along the Mediterranean, and some even East Africans brought to India, and even as far away as the Spice Islands and Australia to be labor forces there as well. So what are the long-term ramifications of this important movement of people and horrific movement of people? I'm taking you back to this critical thinking exercise that I had. Hopefully maybe you paused it and took a look at my questions. But clearly here, you can see a little bit about Europeans' justification of slavery if you study artwork from the period. This picture, which shows Africans on the Middle Passage, right? The ships that transported these millions of people from Africa to the New World in horrific conditions, right? I mean, I don't think we can properly imagine how horrible the transatlantic trade was, right? The Middle Passage, where tens of thousands, if not millions, of Africans died in route between Africa and Asia, Africa and the New World, chained below decks in really kind of horrific conditions. We can't imagine it. But if you see this artist's depiction of these African people, they don't look to be in any sort of suffering or in any sort of pain. In fact, they kind of look almost childlike. And this is really important into the European justification of slavery, right? Europeans inherently understood that slavery was probably wrong. I mean, the Europeans had abolished the idea of slavery during the Middle Ages with the idea of feudalism. But they revived slavery because it fits their purpose, right? They need this large labor force. And so they need a justification to keep Africans enslaved. And if you look at this image, you can kind of understand how the Europeans wanted to depict Black Africans as being somewhat childlike. And this is important to the justification. It's equally important to the idea of the creation of race. Also critical to understand is the understanding that Europeans wanted to also sell the idea that they didn't create slavery. Rather than kind of see themselves as the enslaver, right? No one looked positively on enslavement. So the Europeans didn't want to see themselves as the creators of slavery. They blamed African people themselves. European slave traders always wrote about how they had bought Africans from Africans. And if you can see in this image, there's a very clear depiction by a European artist that the Europeans were not the creators of slavery. They were simply following African practices. It was Africans themselves who sold Africans into slavery. And this is another part of the justification process, right? If Africans are somehow selling their own people into slavery, then the Europeans are not really responsible for the creation of this horrific process. Instead, they're just following suit, so to speak. And so you can see in this image an attempt to create that idea, which of course is not true. Europeans very much created transatlantic slavery, buying Africans for movement across the Atlantic Ocean. And then another kind of key part of the transatlantic slavery was an inherent fear of abolition. Strong abolitionist movements don't really get started until the 19th century. there's not a really strong movement for abolition, at least among white communities, until the 19th century. There had been slave rebellions, which are abolition movements in and of themselves, of course, dating back into the 16th century. And into the 17th century. There are African slave rebellions in the Caribbean. There are African rebellions in Stono, South Carolina, for example, in Brazil. And these are abolitionist movements as well. But there's not a strong white abolitionist movement until the 19th century. And one thing that happens when abolition becomes an idea that's talked about amongst white colonizers is a fear about what would happen. You know, so many, millions of Africans have been transported from Africa to the New World. And in most of what becomes the United States, slaves are a smaller population than the white population, except for, importantly, South Carolina. South Carolina is one of the only colonies where the slave population is as large, or even larger at certain times, than the white population, at least during the colonial period. But if you went to the Caribbean islands, this would absolutely be the case. Or if you went to Brazil, the slave population was much, much larger than the white population. And so there was a fear once abolition got started that if Africans were taken out of slavery, there would be no order, right? The enslaver would become the enslaved. And so that's why this is titled Abolition of the Slave Trade, or The Man and the Master, right? The fear that if, at least among Europeans, that if slavery was ended and slave trade were ended, then there would be oppression of white people in the Americas, which of course is just another justification why to keep slavery going. And so here are some brief summary of what the justifications were that Europeans used to keep Africans enslaved. One of the main arguments European enslavers used was that Africans were unfit for civilized society. They looked to African, West African nations and said, listen, they don't have an effective form of government. They don't utilize the soil the proper way, right? Therefore, they're not really fit for the same type of society that Europeans are. Therefore, we can enslave them in order to kind of bring them up to speed with how society works. Now, of course, no European really wanted to, teach Africans about their civilization. That was just a justification that was used in order to keep enslavement going. Another argument that was made, especially by the Christian nations of Western Europe, was that Africans weren't Christians, and therefore they could be enslaved. Now, this got problematic, especially in Spain. The Spanish and the Portuguese, Catholic nations, often converted their enslaved populations to Catholicism, but that created a problem, right? If a slave was then a Catholic, could they also be enslaved? And so actually in Central America and South America, you'll see enslaved peoples becoming Christian and then actually being able to get their freedom, which is really important. And also there's a paternalistic myth about slavery, right? Especially in British colonies, there was the idea that slave masters are good people. You know, they're taking these childlike Africans and they're watching over them. These are people who were unfit for society, that couldn't really run an effective society. And so slave masters in the American South are paternalistic. And of course, that is entirely a myth. How can you be paternalistic and rely on the violence that is inherent in slavery, right? It doesn't make any sense. And so these are just justifications that were used, but you'll notice all of them create the idea that there's a very important difference between white Europeans and black Africans. And we should note that slavery wasn't the same no matter where you went in the Americas. In particular, in Spanish and Portuguese slavery, I mentioned a bit about the conversion process and how Christian slaves could get their freedom. But also remember that within Spanish society, we had mixed race societies, right? They weren't interested in moving large white populations. And so one of the largest groups of people in New Spain were the mestizos, right? People of mixed Spanish and indigenous blood, sometimes even mixed black blood as well. And so slavery in New Spain and in parts of Brazil looked very different because there wasn't a clear segregation of white and black. There were varying shades of white and black that created a kind of a dualistic society when it came to race. Now, this isn't true for the British colonies in particular, nor the French colonies. Just to talk a little bit about the British, because I think it's what we're all probably a little bit most interested in, living in former British colonies. But the first slaves arrived in what would become the United States in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. And interestingly, even though the British were copying Spanish, Portuguese slavery, these slaves who arrived weren't necessarily chattel for life. Instead, they arrived in 1619 kind of like indentured servants, meaning that they had a fixed period of labor, and then after that they could be given land and freedom. You'll see in this image there's actually a free black man wearing the same clothing as a free white man. But all of this is going to change, right? Slavery is going to move from kind of a fixed term, at least in the British colonies, to a more perpetual form of slavery after 1676, 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. What happens in Virginia is there's a large uprising, there's a rebellion, where former enslaved Africans and enslaved Africans team up with white farmers and planters who had been forced to the West, and they are going to commit this rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion. And what it does is it fears the elite white planters of Eastern Virginia about the cooperation of white and black in Virginia. And so what they do is they move slavery from being kind of a fixed term process to a more perpetual version of it, meaning that if you were the son or daughter of a black enslaved woman, your status was inherently enslaved, right, for life. And so this primogeniture, this process of passing on your status from mother to child, is fixed in 1676 and means that slavery is going to take a much different trajectory in the British colonies. And you'll see that even though, if you read Thomas Jefferson, he thinks that slavery is going to be, he's a slave owner himself. He has relations with an enslaved woman that he owns and children with this enslaved woman, Sally Hemings. But he thinks that slavery is on the way out in North America, in what becomes the United States, because he knows tobacco prices are falling. And he says, well, if tobacco prices aren't worth it, then we're not going to invest in slaves anymore. But what he couldn't have predicted is the immense growth of another product, cotton. So you see up here in 1820, cotton's really only grown mostly just outside of Colombia, actually. But by 1860, you'll notice that there's tons of cottonland, especially in the Gulf Coast region along the Mississippi River. And this means that slavery, which once appeared like maybe it would die out, only increases tremendously. Even after the slave trade is over, the domestic population of slavery continues to increase because of the slave trade, the domestic slave trade, and because of slave practices in the American South. So why do I focus on all of this? Like, what's the point of understanding the construction of race? Importantly, and this is what your weekly response has you reply to, importantly, there are long-term ramifications of that transatlantic slave trade, not just in the United States, and actually not just in the Americas. What happened, one could argue, because of the transatlantic slave trade was an increased attention to racial difference, right? Visible racial difference. The idea that white people and black people, or white people and brown people, or brown people and black people, or people from Asia and brown people, like all these different types of visible racial difference meant that there were inherent differences among people. And this is an idea that kind of grew because of slavery, right? If slavery relied on racial difference, then it came to become an accepted idea that these racial differences are real. But of course, as we just saw, they weren't. They were justifications that were used to keep people enslaved. The problem was that so many people came to kind of, utilize these justifications that they slowly became cemented in, social constructions and legal constructions as being true. And so why do I bring this up? Well, I think, your response is asking you to tell us a little bit about why transatlantic slavery has long-term ramifications, right? Sure, slavery ended in the United States in 1865, and slavery ended in Brazil in the 1880s, right? And slavery ended in the British colonies before that in the 1830s. But the idea that slavery is over is not entirely true, because that social construction of race that slavery relied upon still has important visible effects across the world. So you can see my top image here, right? Comes from the desegregation movement in the 1860s and the 1960s in the U.S. Well, today there are still people who kind of hold on to some of these racial prejudices. In India, of course, Gandhi protested for the inherent rights of Indian people against their British colonizers. And the image to the right on that top image, there's still racial violence in India today between Muslim Indians, Hindi Indians, and also white Indians. Of course, Nazis in Germany played on racial difference. All of these are really important, and it's what I'm asking you to respond to a little bit in your response.